Axl Rose's journey is a collision of raw talent, unresolved childhood trauma, public volatility, artistic obsession, disappearance, reinvention, and a late career endurance that few predicted. Once framed by media as the most dangerous frontman in rock, he now stands in 2025 as a survivor whose story stretches far beyond riots and headlines. This narrative traces the arc from a boyhood scarred by abuse through the forging of a singular rock persona, the implosions that nearly froze his legacy in the 1990s, the improbable discipline shown in later professional pivots, and the complicated reconciliation between myth and man. The tragedy is not a tidy sequence of sensational episodes. It is the persistent echo of early wounds shaping choices, relationships, creativity, and self-defense, until adaptation slowly replaces detonation. A broken beginning. Before the stage lights, there was the instability of a fractured home. Parental separation, allegations of kidnapping by a biological father, and early memories of coercion and abuse seeded a psychological environment where fear and powerlessness were normalized. The young boy learned vigilance early, reading adult moods, anticipating eruptions, internalizing blame. A controlling stepfather imposed religious and behavioral strictures, enforcing conformity while simultaneously violating boundaries. Conditions that taught silence, obedience, and emotional containment. Protectiveness toward his sister became one of the first channels for a nascent rage that he could not release safely. The emotional blueprint was simple and devastating. Love equals volatility. Intimacy brings exposure. Authority is dangerous. These formative contradictions laid the emotional fuse that would later burn across arenas. The child's unprocessed pain did not disappear. It merely waited for amplification. The smart rebel school paperwork painted one profile. Behavior painted another. He reportedly scored highly on placement tests, suggesting cognitive agility and pattern recognition, while clashing relentlessly with structures that demanded passive compliance. Authority figures misread defiance as emptiness rather than misdirected intelligence combined with mistrust. Dropping out, returning, then dropping out again, reflected not a lack of capacity but an early rejection of environments that replicated power dynamics he associated with control. Music, at first hidden from a restrictive household worldview, became a clandestine refuge. Singing was a physiological release valve, breath converted to pitch, pitch into catharsis. Where classrooms saw disruption, embryonic artistry was simply incubating with no sanctioned outlet. Encounters with local law enforcement, fights, confrontations, mounting tension, reinforced a conviction that staying meant escalation. Flight in this context was not mere ambition. It was self-preservation wrapped in creative hunger. Flight to Los Angeles. Arriving in Los Angeles meant immersion in a crucible. The Sunset Strip mid-80s ecosystem merged scarcity, competition, and nocturnal theater. In that compressed social petri dish, fragments of earlier bands consolidated into what would become Guns N' Roses, a volatile blend of guitar architecture, groove drive, and a frontman whose vocal elasticity became a catalytic signature. The voice itself was an instrument of fragmentation and fusion, piercing upper register shrieks riding over distortion, gritty mid-range snarls conveying aggression, unexpectedly warm lower notes hinting at vulnerability. Each performance reenacted the internal dialectic between wounded child and aggressive defender. On stage, he could weaponize fragility into power without asking permission. The band's early ascension was nourished by authenticity, flawed, hungry, unvarnished, radiating a danger that major labels simultaneously feared and coveted. Success arrived like a pressure wave, sudden, magnifying both excellence and instability. Love and wounds in lyrics. Intimate relationships carried the gravitational pull of relief and the charge of risk. A whirlwind marriage that fed lyrical myth dissolved under the strain of volatility, jealousy, and unhealed personal history. Subsequent high-profile romance layered cinematic visual symbolism, wedding imagery, romantic epics, with backstage emotional turbulence. Songs that fans canonized as pure romantic artifacts were often saturated with unresolved fear of abandonment and control. Lyrics accused of misogyny or cruelty can be read along a spectrum. On one end, undisciplined projection; on the other, an attempt to grant permission to experience forbidden emotional intensities without social sanction. Defensiveness in public responses reflected a persistent tension. Was he externalizing pain irresponsibly or translating traumatic residue into art under imperfect emotional governance? Disappearance and the Chinese Democracy Labyrinth. As the initial imperial phase of the band waned, the studio transformed into a psychological bunker. The marathon development of an album that became shorthand for delay symbolized both perfectionist aspiration and avoidance. Personnel changes, shifting producers, evolving technology stacks, and stylistic experimentation created a moving target that postponed definitive closure. Each revision promised an ideal future that could retroactively redeem past chaos. Each delay increased a cultural debt. Obsession with micro-layered sonic sculpting risked disconnection from the visceral immediacy that first generated momentum. Isolation eroded relational trust with former bandmates and fans alike, who interpreted absence as arrogance or indifference rather than a maladaptive strategy for retaining control in a domain. Studio detail, where outcomes felt more governable. When the album finally surfaced, it carried the patina of a time capsule, a document of sustained, sometimes brilliant, sometimes overworked labor, shadowed by opportunity cost. What died in those years was not talent, but timeliness. What survived was a stubborn commitment to realize an internal vision, regardless of external impatience. Reunion and reinvention, reconnecting with estranged bandmates, launched a globally dominant reunion cycle whose staggering grosses recontextualized legacy, not as static nostalgia, but as a living economic and cultural engine. Financial success provided external validation. Internal dynamics demanded renegotiated boundaries, communication protocols, and mutual professional respect. The frontman's role subtly shifted from chaotic gravitational center to one component in a stabilized triad with shared brand stewardship. Large-scale touring also imposed structured routines, sound checks, scheduling, physical conditioning, that functioned as behavioral scaffolding, mitigating former triggers. Fans witnessing punctual shows and extended set lists confronted a reframed identity, intensity without implosion, voice aging and 2025 reality. Vocal evolution over decades is physiologically inevitable. Tissue elasticity shifts, recovery windows widen, range edges recalibrate. Early recordings captured a tensile shriek fused with agile lower resonance. Later performances emphasize phrasing intelligence, breath management, and selective deployment of peak register bursts. Critics and fans debate whether adaptation constitutes decline or seasoned artistry. The mature voice, though altered, carries experiential gravitas absent in youthful ferocity. Choosing when not to chase an historic high note becomes an interpretive act rather than a surrender. What really happened? Compressing the arc yields a sequence of transformations shaped by early injury. Childhood violation destabilized foundational trust and emotional regulation. Adolescent rebellion formed a provisional armor. Meteoric fame amplified unintegrated triggers under a magnifying lens. Public explosions reinforced external hostility and internal alienation, perpetuating the cycle. Therapeutic attempts introduced conceptual frameworks for self-observation without instant mastery. Prolonged studio isolation represented both flight from scrutiny and pursuit of an idealized redemptive artifact. The AC/DC pivot operationalized discipline, proving alternative behavioral scripts viable. Reunion economics facilitated resource abundance that reduced scarcity panic and allowed identity reframing from volatile icon to professional legacy steward. Aging vocal adjustments and ongoing touring reinforced the narrative that survival, not perpetual combustion, is the final dramatic act. What really happened is not a single catastrophic fall. It is a decades-long negotiation between trauma imprint, and adaptive reconstruction, each career milestone either amplifying or damping unresolved echoes. The tragedy persists in irreversible losses, time consumed by avoidance, relationships strained beyond repair, but the later chapters document agency reasserting itself over reflex. Conclusion. Axl Rose's story defies neat morality plays. It illustrates how early trauma can weaponize giftedness, how public success can both mask and magnify private fragmentation, and how reinvention demands unglamorous incremental work, far from the spotlight's mythic frames. The narrative's most instructive feature is its refusal of binary verdicts, neither irredeemable villain nor sanitized hero, but a complex artist whose survival arc now carries as much cultural weight as the incendiary ascent that preceded it. The tragic true story is not merely the darkness he endured or inflicted, it is also the long, uneven reclamation of authorship over a life once governed by inherited pain. That reclamation, still imperfect and unfolding on global stages in 2025, is the quiet counterpoint to the amplified scream that first made the world listen.